Hello, in this video I kind of wanted to finish off the series that we were doing on the CapK. In the last video I kind of switched over to talking about answering the CapK because I think that although it's like an argument that a lot of teams are well stocked up on block-wise, I think as the debate goes later on, people get a little bit more unfamiliar with the arguments that they're trying to make and maybe unfamiliar with like the blocks themselves and the types of objectives they should be achieving with the arguments that they're reading. And so I kind of wanted to talk about how I think about the functioning of all these different parts of the debate in terms of two different approaches to answering the CapK for policy teams. First is from the impact turn strategy, the more like cap sustainable strategy, and another one that's more about link turn strategy that is based in being able to win the permutation, and probably a much more soft or less strategy that's more in the direction of the alternative than an impact turn strategy is. I'm going over these two types of perspectives to basically kind of talk about them because I think that they're two approaches that a lot of teams take in most of their decisions on how they should answer this critique, and I also think that these two approaches can be really helpful in a lot of other contexts outside of just the CapK. And so I thought it would be helpful to make a video that kind of talks about the goals and the ways that these two different types of arguments interact with the different pieces of the debate, and the tips I have on the types of arguments that you should be trying to execute in order to like really create a holistic strategic vision for the judge at the end of the debate, and an idea of how these different parts kind of like feed into each other, so you can think about why you're making certain arguments and why you're spending time in certain places, because that's really integral to getting like a really like fluid motion and being able to just answer the arguments really efficiently, whether it's like a one-off strategy or whether it's part of a much bigger strategy that involves like several different types of 2-and-R options. So to kind of like resume what we were talking about before, in the last video I started by talking about how these two approaches would think about framework, how they would think about the kind of like top level thesis of the debate, and how they would think about the link level of debate. In this video I kind of want to start off talking about the permutation. For the impact turn strategy, the permutation part of the debate I think is a lot less essential because you're not really going for a compatibility argument between the AF and the alternative, because you're kind of already conceding that the AF is going in a different direction. So I think most times it's not really worth to put in a crazy amount of time on this argument, but I think that one of the better arguments that you could make in order to kind of like force the negative's hand is to make an argument about the comparability between the affirmative and the alternative in terms of the idea of scale. I think making arguments about why the AF is necessary for the alternative to scale up in a system that can like still have a possible transition. Maybe the AS plan needs to come first and then we think about the alternative later, which can really build like much more in-depth sequencing questions that I think give a lot more like detail and kind of like texture to the permutation arguments that you would want to make with this type of argument. I do think that a permutation would be more of a fail-safe type of argument, but I think the reason why kind of making these other types of challenges is important is because it allows you to kind of like hold the alternative to a standard later on about how it's going to be able to resolve these questions, even if that's not the place where you want to use that piece of offense the most. I think in the context of a link turn strategy, this is a really important part of the debate because it is a piece where a lot of the links arguments get decided, and you get to force the alternative to be as mutually exclusive as possible in order to get out of the permutation, which means that you can stop the alternative from being able to access a lot of the impacts that the AF has, which can be integral to debating it later on. I think outside of that, example debating is super important to make sense of because it allows you to think about what the role of the alternative is in relationship to the AF and vice versa, and building that types of connection can really allow you to explain your arguments and apply that on a much higher level when you're thinking about how you want to use them in the context of the other parts of the debate, which is similar to what I was saying in the last video about how you want to use the permutation and the link arguments. I think building really good examples of the compatibility between your AF and what anti-capitalism will look like in a way in which that type of organizing model could be helpful and comparable to the alternative might be really good in terms of being able to kind of like flip the script on the access question at the level of impact, especially if you're able to make permutation arguments about the way in which the affirmative impacts that you're isolating put barriers in front of the process of being able to organize against capital. And I think in that context you're both raising the threshold of the ability for the alternative to kind of get over those barriers while also winning arguments about why the AF may be integral and a prerequisite that comes before the implementation of the alternative, which I think can be a really important part of your strategy. I think in terms of the impact comparison portion of this debate, this is probably the most important part of the debate for the impact turn strategy, because it's the part where a lot of the framing questions are really important here. This is kind of what I was saying before about why winning those earlier on ethical questions that may pop up on the framework or on this part of the debate are really important, because it really contextualizes how we evaluate the importance of certain types of scenarios and what impact defense and offense looks looks like under an impact turn strategy, making arguments about why the judge should think about the ethicality of a system versus the sustainability or like reliability or efficiency of that system is a really important part to being able to build a really cohesive strategy that is able to win a kind of framing for the debate that is strategic for you. I think making arguments about transition and sustainability that force the alternative to scale up to the arguments that you want to make is how you really get an edge in these impact turn debates. It's not just about whether or not a certain system is good or bad, but you should make that question more complex by asking the question of whichever system that we decide is good or bad, what is the like mechanism for being able to put that system into place and make it realizable. And this can allow you to like just couple that with really good impact defense that resolves the most predictable impacts that like teams that are reading the CapK want to go for. Arguments about the environment and the way that innovation and technology relate to the environment, arguments about the military and like resource extraction, etc., and arguments about like localized like inequality and exploitation, I think are all things that you need to be ready to speak to at the level of impact defense. But I think if you're able to kind of throw these other barriers and make that question more complex, then you have a really good footing in this part of the debate. I think for the link turn strategy, I think that it's just a question of being able to build like really unique comparisons between the types of impacts that the AF is talking about versus the alternative. For a lot of policy affirmatives, you're talking about like scenario kind of like contingent impacts that are happening that are like that are scenarios that you're trying to plan a way to resolve. But I think that being able to use that as a way to magnify the types of impacts that happen under a much more structural critique is a good en route to like winning a lot of arguments about a lot of ways that your argument interacts with theirs. I think being able to control the interactions and how like each impact magnifies each can be like really important space of control that requires you to win a lot of example debating of the way in which your AF relates to the idea of capitalism and how it plays into the way in which capitalism is managed under the law. And I think doing that can allow you to win really creative in routes to like why maybe even a world where you're not able to win on a magnitude level, why the AF is a lot more feasible when it comes down to the level of like methods of like what we should do in terms of how we should relate to capitalism, even if we both agree that we should like get rid of it, right? So, and then I think at the alternative level, this is kind of where a lot of the impact comparison stuff that I was just talking about becomes really effective, because I think at the alternative level, for the impact turn strategy, when you're really able to force to kind of like scale up large questions that you're forcing with the kind of impact scenarios that you're speaking through and the way you're asking about the efficiency of the system that the other team is offering, then you have a lot of ways that you can push the alternative to not be able to kind of reach the kind of like magnitude that the AF does, which can give you a lot of weight in an impact turn debate and kind of like make the debate a little bit more complex than maybe just the straight up just whether or not capitalism itself is good or bad. And I think forcing those types of questions are the best in round against this alternative. I think against the types of affirmatives that you're bound to read when you're going for an impact turn strategy, the alternative is probably meant much more to be something that is meant to be fully offensive against the affirmative, that says that we should maybe like refuse the affirmatives like attachment to the economy, that we should like let the economy fail, that we should have a revolution against capitalism. And I think when all those things happen, you have a lot of access to a lot of arguments and barriers that show to really make that transition stuff that I was talking about before really pop in this context. And I think in the link turn context, the alternative arguments that you want to make is just about the question of whether or not the alternative would end up causing the plan or not, and if it doesn't, how does it resolve the type of barriers that are still placed in a world where the plan doesn't exist, and how does that become like something that becomes generalizable for like the United States as a whole, right? How does it become something that becomes translatable to a praxis that is identified beyond like very localized context? And I think forcing those questions can be integral to making like a really good strategy against capitalism as a whole, and thinking about the alternative as it like relates to being able to tie all these other parts together. Hopefully this video and this series was really helpful for you thinking about the CAC and where you think about the strategic use of it and the way that you should be thinking about how each part interacts. And hopefully you'll tune into like more of the videos that I'm doing on different types of arguments and the way that I think you can think about resolving them.